Visual Studio Code is a fantastic extensible code editor and make your own IDE that many use for developing software. Extensions are really the core of Visual Studio Code and enable it as a multi-tool that's great for many different programming languages. It ranks number 3 for the best programming text editor on Slant.io. If you search for any other lists for top 5 editors, you're likely to find VS Code in that list. So, stop using VS Code. If free and open source software matters to you, that's one big reason why you might not want to use Visual Studio Code. Additionally, Visual Studio collects your data. There's the language server protocol, which has good implications for the future of development tools. Last, there are some alternatives that are a pretty good replacement for VS Code. The landing page has the tagline free and built on open source. If you're not familiar with the language around free and open source software, this might have you fooled into believing that Visual Studio Code is in fact free and open source software when it's not. This is very similar to how Google Chrome, or rather Google, they open sourced the Chromium browser, which anyone can contribute to and work on, and then they built the proprietary closed source version, Google Chrome, on top of that. The benefit is they get all the help and people being able to learn about Google Chrome working through Chromium without needing to look at the closed source code. And they can also have all of the nasty stuff that they don't want you to see hidden away, but they usually also add useful features, and of course, people like useful features that make it so unless free and open source software is a priority to them, they'll always pick the Google Chrome or the proprietary closed source version. And there's a whole lot of people out there that just use these tools and they don't tend to think about free and open source software and what it means. And so for them, they don't care. Visual Studio Code is a very similar situation. Visual Studio Code has a free and open source software version called Code OSS. They package up the FOSS version and then they add features, which most importantly, in my opinion, is the Visual Studio Marketplace integration. And they add telemetry and data collection and all that other things that you probably don't want. Not all of the Visual Studio Code extensions are open source. That is, anyone who develops an extension of Visual Studio Code are free to choose a license where they can close source their software. The extensions from the Visual Studio Marketplace integration and the proprietary version of Visual Studio Code is what makes VS Code such a fantastic multi-tool. VS Codium is a free and open source fork of Microsoft's Code OSS that has the telemetry and tracking stripped. It's under a more permissive free and open source license. Additionally, though, it also does not have that proprietary extension marketplace. The problem with this is that it means because it does not have that, its features are basically gimped. You're not going to have the same exact experience using VS Codium as you would using VS Code because oftentimes those extensions make or break VS Code and its usefulness as that multi-tool. If you had been using Visual Studio Code recently for Python development, you may have noticed the recent switch from using the Pyrite Python language server to the Pylance language server. The difference between these two is that the Pylance codebase is not open source, but Pyrite was. Microsoft was actually developing, and fantastically enough, it was an open source project. They then took this open source project and they built this closed source proprietary Pylance extension on top of it, thereby outmoding the older free and open source extension. Well, the Pyrite version can be outright used and integrated with other code editors like Vim, Sublime, Emacs, and apparently even the command line. So that's really useful. Pylance, on the other hand, has nothing on the page, the GitHub page, on how you can integrate this with a code editor of your choice. So if you want to use Pylance, you're restricted to sticking with Visual Studio Code's proprietary platform. As it turns out, there is actually an NVim Pylance extension you could use with NeoVim to get Pylance in your Vim. So that way you can use Microsoft's proprietary Pylance language server and use it in Vim instead of having to use Visual Studio Code. However, because of a recent update, this was back in October, it's no longer possible to run it, and instead you get prompted with this license. So you can no longer use it, and the developer of this NeoVim extension even says you have to default to using the outmoded and probably outdated Pyrite instead of Microsoft's newer and updated Pylance that is closed source. Obviously, this is a drawback for developers because with the open source software, you have the choice of electing to use whatever editor you want with this language server. If you want to use Pylance, well, you have to use Visual Studio Code now. Recently, Apple introduced features that allowed iPhone users to block social media companies, much like Meta, from tracking their data. And the net result seems to have been around the board for those companies something like this, where their stock had a big dip and they lost a lot of money. And it should show you that companies get a lot of money off of your data. It's not just something that's used to improve their product. They're selling it to advertisers and they're making money off of your data, and it's money that you don't even really get to see. If you are leery about telemetry and you don't want to be sending your data to Microsoft, you apparently can disable it. An alarming post by this Reddit user seems to disagree about really how effective that is. It seems like they're still getting quite a bit of data from you regardless if you're using the proprietary Visual Studio Code. So this user says he's man in the middle and taking a look at the data that gets sent back, and it does just say that you've opted out, but also it apparently will send requests for updates, the info about your plugins, and other stuff which this user didn't mention. Some of those settings was even ignored even if you set the settings correctly. So it seems like simply disabling telemetry in VS Code isn't really enough to stop them from gathering your data. There are stuff you can do, like, for example, blocking the DNS connects to the that would pick up your data in your host file on your machine. And apparently, there are expanded settings beyond just the top two, which should also reduce as much telemetry, additional telemetry, as possible. This just seems really sketchy, and it seems like a lot more work than it should be to simply delabel telemetry entirely. Why can't it just be one setting and it seems kind of paranoid if you have to go out of your way to add the endpoint servers to your host file so that way it doesn't route there and send out your data. This Reddit user goes on to say that he knows a guy seemingly personally at Microsoft, and of course you can't really tell if that's true or not, but according to him, Microsoft loves telemetry and they don't really care how their users feel about that. They take it all because they can use it to make their products better. So it seems like whether or not you would like to disable telemetry, it seems like it's really a false thing. They seemingly let you opt out of it, but the reality, it looks like there's no opting out of it. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you shouldn't assume you have privacy. And of course, this is Microsoft. This is a big company. I wouldn't assume with any big tech companies like this, whenever using their products, that there's any sort of privacy. It just seems like a simple common sense thing you can do is you can say, hey, if I'm on the Windows operating system, I don't have privacy. And you'd probably be right. Before, I mentioned the Pyrite and the Pylance language server protocols for the Python programming language. Bright side to Visual Studio Code having existed is that Microsoft themselves seems to have invented this concept of a language server protocol, which I believe is really going to drive forward how developers use their integrated development environments as well as editors and how they program. Simply put, the benefit to using a language server protocol is that it solves the problem of providing high level support for any programming language in any, and that's the key word, any editor, IDE, or client. Historically, high level language support was dependent on that specific editor or that specific IDE. So, for example, if you wanted Visual Studio, notice that's not Visual Studio Code, it's just original Visual Studio. If you wanted that sort of auto completion and that tooling, you had to use Visual Studio because those features and that support for, say, languages like C Sharp or C++ were developed particularly for that IDE. It's kind of funny thinking about this with the previous example because we went from an open source Pyrite language server protocol that could be utilized and used in any editor or IDE, and Microsoft themselves transitioned into their proprietary closed source, Pylance. Obviously, that kind of sucks because you can't take that and use that in other editors because it is closed source. I don't think people would really want to use VS Code or use Pylance if they understood this, because then they know if everybody gravitates towards developing the open source language server protocol, that means you can get a unilateral experience for developers everywhere. So, if you're not going to use Visual Studio Code, what are some good replacements? I'll start with what I think are the best and go on to some ones that I think are quite not as good, but might be suitable depending on your use case. So for me, the editor that I replaced VS Code with is K. In recent years, I feel like the KDE editor has come a long way, and actually, the experience is really similar to coding in Visual Studio Code, so I don't think you'll be missing much. Here is the VK editor opened, and it's the same kind of concept, right? You have the text window up here, you have tabs up here, so I can go to and open a new tab, and I can flip between the tabs at the top. I can browse the files and the left on the file browser and the kind of like the folder structure of the project. And I can have a terminal at the bottom. Another alternative is NeoVim, and I am a Vimmer. I use Vim. I always need it in whatever editor I'm using. And so when I was using Visual Studio Code, I actually ran an extension that allowed me to run NeoVim directly in Visual Studio Code, and I found it was a lot better than the default Vi extension for Visual Studio Code. So yeah, and NeoVim is great. I don't think I touch really personally a lot of the features that NeoVim or the improvements it would offer over Vim, but yeah, if you're going to be using a Vim, you might as well use the best one, and I think that's NeoVim. Yeah, another alternative is Emacs. I mean, I've tried Emacs, and personally, it's not for me, of course. I'm a Vimmer, but a problem that probably both Emacs and NeoVim have, and a reason why I would choose K over using either of them, is that they require a lot of configuration. Even things like Doom Emacs, it's just a little bit too complicated, and really all I need is a good GUI with Vim inside of it, and that makes me happy. So, yeah, if you're the type of person who like that level of extensible and customizable editor, Emacs is definitely a great replacement. I just think it's a little bit complicated, but it's a good choice. VS Codium, another alternative one, and I put this toward the end of my five potential alternate choices from Visual Studio Code because I figure, look, why would you want to pick something in the same vein of Visual Studio Code when you know you're kind of like working around Microsoft trying to offer you this other proprietary version? I don't want to say it's a bad project because obviously, I mean, this is a good option. It's just me personally, and maybe I'm a bit too of a purist. I would just avoid it just because it's associated with Visual Studio Code, and I'm fine with somebody telling me that's a stupid reason. But yeah, it might be pretty good. Last and least is Atom. I was looking for another extensible type of text editor that was kind of modern, and I thought about Atom being developed by GitHub. The big thing with this, and especially if you don't trust Microsoft, is that while GitHub is developing this and it's free and open source, at least it seems to be more so than Visual Studio Code, is that Microsoft bought GitHub. And so it's kind of weird. So now Microsoft owns Visual Studio Code. They also seem to own GitHub. So basically, they own Atom and Visual Studio Code. And it's strange. These products seem to kind of compete. So, just a final note before we end. Yeah, and this should be common sense. If your job requires you to use Visual Studio Code, or you're already using the Windows operating system, or free and open source software isn't a priority to you, then you probably should just keep using Visual Studio Code. The point of this video wasn't to tell you that Visual Studio Code is a bad editor. Really, the problem I'm trying to say is that Visual Studio Code is a great editor, and it sucks because it's proprietary closed source software. Why can't we have an open source editor that's better? And so I would really obviously prefer if something like Kate got a lot more attention, and then all that development effort that people might be contributing to the open source portion of Visual Studio Code, they would instead direct that toward Kate. That way, we're not trying to develop on a proprietary platform, and it's more open, and there's more options for everybody. Links to some of the websites and the sources that I've used in this video are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and if you think this has been helpful, then please like and subscribe. Have a good one.